The Secret History of King Arthur, Myth, Violence, and the Dark Ages of Britain. King Arthur. Just saying the name feels like a promise. Honor, nobility, shining armor, knights of the Round Table, justice and heroism. It feels so solid, so familiar, that it almost seems like Arthur must have been real. Like he's not a legend, just history that got a little romantic over time. But here's the weird part. The deeper historians dig, the faster that image falls apart. Dates disappear, witnesses vanish, sources turn out to be written hundreds of years after the events. And instead of noble knights, what starts to surface is violence, betrayal, sex scandals, crime, political propaganda. So who was King Arthur really? A real king? A war leader? Or just a story someone badly needed at the right moment in history? And why did Europe's most powerful legends come out of the Dark Ages? A time of collapse, chaos, and fear? Fair warning, there's almost nothing noble in this story. There's blood, magic used to excuse violence, monks writing erotic scenes, and knights who look a lot more like gang leaders than heroes. When Britain was left on its own. Early 5th century, the Roman Empire is falling apart, and one day Rome gives Britain an order that changes everything. The legions are leaving for good. The Romans weren't just conquerors, they were management. Roads, forts, law, bureaucracy, soldiers on the borders. Yes, it was occupation, but it also meant safety. And then suddenly, nothing. Within years, Britain starts sliding into chaos. From the north come the Picts, from the west the Scots, and from the east a new threat, Saxons, Germanic mercenaries. Here's the irony. The Saxons were invited. A local British ruler named...
Before I tell you what happened next, if you are into real history without polish or fairy tales, if you want to understand how legends are created and why they often say more about the people who tell them than about the past itself, subscribe to the channel. Here, we talk about history the way it's rarely shown, through sources, context, and uncomfortable questions. And trust me, it's about to get darker and much stranger.
Right, where was I? The ruler's name was Vortigern. He hired the Saxons to protect Britain. Classic mistake. The mercenaries turned out to be very good at their job and decided they liked the island. The Saxons started taking land, slowly, methodically, no poetry involved. And right here, in the middle of this mess, a figure appears. Someone later generations will call Arthur. But here's the key thing. There are no records from his lifetime. None.
Arthur appears 300 years too late. Everything we know about the early wars between Britons and Saxons was written centuries later. The first time the name Arthur shows up is at the end of the 8th century, about 300 years after he supposedly lived. A monk named Nennius writes a book called The History of the Britons. And Arthur isn't a king. He's a dux bellorum, a war leader, a commander, a professional fighter. Nennius lists several battles Arthur supposedly fought, including the famous Battle of Mount Badon. The Britons won, that much seems true,
And then things get weird. One version claims Arthur personally killed 960 Saxons. Why 960? Why not 1,000? How does anyone count that in a chaotic battle? And how does one man do that without modern weapons or pure fantasy? There's no explanation. There never was. But the story stuck.
Geoffrey of Monmouth, the man who made it all up. 12th century. Enter the most important person in the Arthur story, Geoffrey of Monmouth. He writes The History of the Kings of Britain, a book modern historians don't consider a real historical source at all. Even his own contemporaries were suspicious. But this is where the Arthur we recognize is born. Merlin, Uther Pendragon, Arthur conceived through magical deception, great wars, Modred's betrayal, the island of Avalon. Geoffrey claimed he used an ancient manuscript written in the Britons' language given to him by a priest. Problem is, no one has ever seen this manuscript, ever. Most likely, it never existed, but the story was too good to question.
Was Arthur a real person? Historians mostly agree on one thing. The legendary King Arthur never existed. But was there a real person behind the myth? Maybe, but every candidate is messy. Riothemus, a British leader who fought in Gaul. His name might mean great king, or might not. He might have been betrayed, or not. He might not even have ruled in Britain. Ambrosius Aurelianus, a Roman aristocrat who led resistance against the Saxons, or possibly two different people with the same name. Lucius Artorius Castus, a Roman officer from the 2nd century. Same sounding name, almost nothing else. The honest conclusion? We don't know. Most likely there was a strong war leader in the 6th century who slowed the Saxons for a while. Everything else was added later.
The Normans, turning a warlord into an ideal. By the 11th century, the Britons had lost, the Anglo-Saxons had won, and then the Normans conquered everyone. And suddenly, Arthur mattered again. The Normans loved knightly stories. They needed an ancient, noble hero, someone who made their rule feel legitimate. Local storytellers caught on fast. Arthur stopped being a half-forgotten war leader. He became the perfect king. All the rough Celtic myths, the blood, curses, strange magic were cleaned up, reshaped, and made respectable. This is how Arthurian legend really took shape.
France, Camelot, and the Round Table. Next stop, France. And this is where the Arthur story really explodes. French poets took a half-forgotten British war legend and turned it into a full-blown European phenomenon. They weren't interested in gritty post-Roman Britain or endless tribal wars. They wanted romance, drama, symbolism, something elegant and emotional. So they started adding things. Camelot, a perfect court at the center of the world. The Round Table, not just furniture, but an idea. No head of the table, no one above the others, all knights equal. At least in theory. Fairies, monsters, enchanted forests, and most importantly, courtly love. Refined, painful, forbidden. And here's the quiet shift that happens. Arthur slowly moves to the background. He's still there, still king, still important, but he's no longer the main character.
the spotlight moves to the knights, their quests, their choices, their failures. The legend stops being about one great man. It becomes a whole world. And then someone introduces a single idea that changes the tone of the entire story.
The Holy Grail, and knights who go the wrong way. That idea is the Holy Grail. Chrétien de Troyes introduces it as a mysterious, almost uncomfortable object. Not a weapon, not treasure, not glory, something spiritual, something demanding. Everyone wants it. Everyone feels called to find it. But here's the detail that people often miss. Arthur doesn't go. He stays behind. He rules. He listens to disputes. He manages the kingdom. In modern terms, he delegates. The quest goes to his best knights: Galahad, Percival, Bors. And this is where the legend gets interesting. Most of them fail, not because they're weak fighters, but because they're human. They get distracted, they fall in love, they make compromises, they choose comfort over purpose. Only Galahad succeeds, and not because he's stronger, but because he's pure, almost inhumanly so. Suddenly, the story isn't about bravery or victory anymore. It's about temptation, about limits, about the gap between who we want to be and who we actually are. The legend grows up. Monks, eroticism, and hypocrisy. Now here's a twist that surprises almost everyone. Some of the most detailed Arthurian stories were written by monks, and strangely enough, those versions contain the most explicit erotic scenes. Monks officially condemned courtly love. They preached discipline, restraint, moral purity, and then they wrote long, vivid descriptions of affairs, desire, and temptation. Knights cheat openly. Queens betray their husbands. Violence is casual, expected, almost boring, and no one really apologizes for it. This isn't hypocrisy by accident, it's honesty. The Middle Ages weren't naive or idealistic. They knew people were flawed. They knew power corrupted. They knew desire didn't disappear just because someone wore armor or took vows. Later centuries romanticized this world. The people who lived in it didn't.
Thomas Malory, the criminal who wrote the ending. By the 15th century, the Arthurian world is massive, confusing, contradictory. And then one man pulls it all together. Sir Thomas Malory writes Le Morte d'Arthur, the book that becomes the definitive version of the legend. And Malory himself is complicated. He's a knight and also a criminal. He's accused of robbery, horse theft, sexual violence, repeated prison escapes. And yes, he writes the book in prison. It feels almost too perfect. Le Morte d'Arthur isn't a clean, heroic story. It's dark, melancholic, heavy with regret. The round table falls apart. Friendships collapse. Ideals fail under pressure. This isn't a fairy tale about winning. It's a tragedy about trying and failing to live up to an ideal that was always impossible.
Arthur. After Arthur.
After that, Arthur never really goes away. He just changes form. Mark Twain turns him into satire, mocking blind tradition and fake nobility. Monty Python strips the legend down to absurdity, coconuts, nonsense, and sudden violence. The 19th century rebuilds the knight as the perfect gentleman, the moral ideal of manhood. Each era reshapes Arthur into what it needs. If a real Arthur ever existed, he was probably nothing like the legend. Likely illiterate, violent, wrapped in the remains of Roman armor, fighting to survive in a broken world. But at this point, that doesn't matter. Camelot isn't a place you can visit. It exists in stories, in books, in imagination. And in the end, words turned out to be stronger than stone.